I had been following the war through the internet and came upon this very small statement in the BBC about this oil spill that happened as a result of a rocket hit in a small town on the coast of Lebanon. And the more I found out about it, the more I studied it, the more I realized that it was really a metaphor for the entire situation. It was in so many ways, there was a stupidity and irony to it and a complexity to it. And it, over time, became sort of a personal obsession to use it as a statement about this and all war.
On one level, it's immediately gettable from an emotional perspective. You don't have to know any of the background story. You don't have to know that there was a bomb in Lebanon that created an oil slick. You hear a tortured opening, you hear an incredibly painful but beautiful slow movement, you react to this. What's most interesting with Jonathan is that he backs up that emotional writing with real academic rigor in his music. So it all fits together on a very well thought out and intricately complicated way of writing, but we don't care about that as musicians. We care that it affects us, and as listeners we care that it affects us, and it does. Jonathan really knows clearly what he wants to hear. In a piece like Hiei, the importance of what was underpinning it for him with what was going on in the Middle East gives him a kind of urgency in his music making with the artists, and it's quite invigorating to be part of that.
For several years, the Toronto School of Theology has wanted to do one kind of significant arts event every year, and this year the Institute for Christian Studies came along with a really attractive idea involving a composer, Jonathan Berger, who was going to be doing a lecture for them, and from there we began thinking about a larger event that would involve a concert and a panel. So this was just a wonderful gift to us to be able to bring theology and the arts and other areas into conversation with each other in a way that showed the richness of religious experience in life.
This concern for sort of the social efficacy of art hasn't really been taken up in the area of music and ethics as much as it has been in other areas. And that has to do with the very abstract nature of music. It's not representational like visual arts or the verbal arts are. So it's sometimes hard to see the connect between form and content. Themes that you want to take up, there's a tendency just to focus on form and how it sounds, etc. But it's a very evocative art form, and so there is an interest to see, how its incredible ability to move our emotions translates into its social significance for us.
It was also announced that along with the performance of the music, there would be a discussion. And to me, this was one of the strongest features of the whole educational enterprise, is that there were performers with theoreticians, philosophers, teachers, graduate students, and an engaged audience who could ask questions and get responses from the sources. And this had a very edifying feel, if I can say that word, to have a community of people who are from different perspectives dealing with the fact that we need to have art that is indeed speaking to the needs of the people today.
Music seems to be as old as civilization itself, and there's no civilization that we know that doesn't have music of some kind. So it clearly answers some very basic, even primal needs in human society for connection, for the expression of emotion, for marking significant passages, birth, marriages, death. And a lot of musical forms have evolved out of those specific kinds of purposes. So in one kind of basic sense, music is always serving some kind of social role. I think when we're talking about the specific question, can music leverage particular kinds of social change, you get into trickier territory. But we know from recent examples, protest music, obviously politicized popular music, has had direct effects on changing things by motivating action. So I think that power is always there in music.
As a composer, we rarely get the chance to talk about issues that arise from our music, and in a way, we're deceiving ourselves if we think that the music is pure and complete unto itself, because it's not. It raises issues, and generally we don't get to discuss them or take ownership of them. And too often we leave that to other people, and people miss the perspective of the actual composer, the creator, and the performers, the people who produce the music, are ironically silent. So yeah, it's a nice chance to weigh in and to think maybe for the first time about the implications of what it is that we do.
The music can only take you so far. It requires an inner adjustment on the listener's part. When you're pulling back from precise signification, you're leaving something ambiguous enough to reformulate possibilities for social life, for re-envisioning the future. That is the sense of hope that I was trying to capture.
I understand, but I would go so far as to say that writing music is absolutely a declaration of hope. The fact that you would spend the time to move from silence to another moment of silence, interrupted by music, you have to have all the hope in the world to do that. I think being a musician is also a blind desire for hope. It's the expression itself is hope.
The piece that we featured in the concert, the GI, is in many ways an extremely formal piece of music. And yet we know from the circumstances under which it was written and the imagery that's associated with it, that it is in fact addressing one of the great tragedies of our world, and that it's a double tragedy. It's the tragedy of war and the tragedy of environmental degradation, and how these two came together.
I think, first of all, an event that takes music out of its own bubble and puts it in a social context in and of itself is important. And I think we don't do enough of it, and certainly we musicians don't spend enough time with it. I think the issue of socially responsible music, well, I would start by saying what would be socially irresponsible music? And I think that for me, there are really two answers here. One is the fact that I find it impossible to separate my political social awareness from what I do in anything in life, and music is principally what I do. So it's a sort of natural coalescence. But the other piece of it is that I think there's a major segment of the world of art, and particularly music, that has so removed itself from the issue of communication and expression. And that social responsibility in music is really just a small part of a bigger picture of a music that is about human expression and intercourse.
Jonathan Berger was talking about the fact that, we have the sin of silence, so we're going to make some sounds now. Well, what kind of sounds are you going to make with an oil spill? So you make a lament. And at least the way the Bible talks about it too, sometimes the cries are just inarticulate groans and moans. And the kind of music that we heard held some of that, but it didn't stay there.
I think in a case like this, which is a musical political statement, it's important to not treat everything with beauty, which I think in music a lot of times we want to do. That's our inclination. But in this piece there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of ugliness, which I think that friction needs to come across. I think that's the reason he wrote it. As a performer, as somebody who's trying to get that across, sometimes it can be a little counterintuitive because we always are looking to make the most beautiful sounds, but I think in this case it's more about the lasting effect that the music will have. And so that's been sort of the challenge for me as a performer tackling this piece, is to keep that in mind. And working directly with the composer helps immensely with that, because you have this repetition in your head about what really the point of the creation of the piece was.
I know both John Rea and James Rolfe by reputation and as friends, but also as colleagues, and I know that first and foremost they write interesting music, which is always, it's what music you want to hear when you're sitting in the audience, and those are two composers that I would want to hear their music. But in addition to that, I know that they are very socially engaged people. I know that John Rea, I know him as somebody who thinks very carefully about social context of music and has a very broad range of academic and musical interests. So he will incorporate various aspects of literature, science, mathematics, all these things. But on top of all that, he has a really great ear. His music has a presence both musically and contextually.
I think there's a balance always at work in a piece of music between the structure, if you will, which is an abstract kind of term, like how the piece is constructed, and the content of the piece, form and content, I guess, going back to that kind of a thing. So there is this balance, there's dialogue between those two elements where they support each other or where they conflict with each other. There may be an emotional kind of a melodic or harmonic tilt to the content, but the form might constrain it and perhaps put it at a remove. But there is definitely a balance that you try to strike as a composer, not to milk something too much, not to sort of stop short, not to say everything, but to leave some things unsaid, perhaps.
To my mind, underneath everything that's been said so far is a tension between two not necessarily mutually exclusive ways to look at art. One that we could call the purely aesthetic, the disinterested Kantian idea of art for its own sake. And the other, let's call it the Platonic instrumental view, that poetry or art should serve a specific program, perhaps sanctioned by the state, as in the Republic. And I don't think that those are mutually exclusive, because I think that tension can actually be a productive tension within a single work. And neither side needs to be what the piece reduces to. And so I like to think of this, I guess, in terms of the successful piece is the one that justifies its breaking of silence. And it's, I think, perhaps my favorite remark of Jonathan's earlier was that the refusal to remain silent is not only a creative impulse, but a kind of bearing witness. And that the piece needs to justify the fact that it arose from silence and will subside in silence. And that its peculiar normativity then is not necessarily reducible ever to propositional content, certainly, or even to a specific ethical position. But instead it makes me feel like that normativity that Rilke talks about in the Torso poem, right? That what does the statue say to you? The statue says you must change your life. It doesn't tell you how or in what direction, just that you come away from an artwork like that with a sense that something needs to change. I'm fascinated by that sort of normativity, which isn't precisely ethical in the sense of having any specific position or program to it.
One of the things I think is really important with regard to music is that it be socially significant. To be socially significant, it has to be perceived as such by the people who are listening to it. And for them to perceive it as socially significant, there has to be something going on in their lives. A certain awareness of their own need, a certain awareness of their own circumstance that makes them open to receive what the music has to offer. So it's not just a matter of whether the music can get through, but it's also whether the people are ready to experience it and ready to take into their own experience what the music opens up.
Socially engaged music, in some sense, might be seen as a tool, even as an arm for good, if that is one possible understanding of socially engaged music making. So that we have a sense of duty, perhaps as we understand that word in philosophical parlance that comes to us from Kant. There's a duty to do something which would be good. And engaging with music, engaging with the audience, engaging with even the creative act itself, tough thing to do, but I saw that a little bit as an arm or as a tool for good.
As a composer, you want to be connected to society, if you will. There are lots of different ways to do that. But it sometimes can be a struggle because the medium that we work in, concerts, is a pretty marginal medium. It's not exactly a popular medium. The audiences aren't huge. A lot of people aren't aware of what we're doing. Most people thinking about music think about popular music, right? So it's consumed through recordings, in the past through the radio, through the internet, mediums which are recorded rather than live. And that's, I think, one of the main things that we do, which actually is different and relevant, is that our music is primarily consumed in a live medium.
A lot of people, again, I think if they don't experience it, they wouldn't even realize how accessible much new music actually is. And that there's a lot more that music can do than deliver, 3-chord progressions and simple melodies of the sort that you hear every day. So exposure actually creates accessibility, but if there's a perception of inaccessibility, that halts exposure. And I think this is a kind of, a classic kind of bind. And musicians who are literally academics don't have any particular motivation to worry about exposure because it's not their bread and butter. Mm-hmm. That's a problem too, the kind of academicization of the musical community, into professors. But art needs people to look at it, to hear it, to experience it. I always think of Heidegger saying that the mere object is not the work of art. A painting that nobody's looking at, a sculpture that nobody is touching, music that nobody's hearing, it's not the work of art yet. It's the possibility, but it's not yet the work of art.
I talked to one of the composers afterwards who was on our panel, and he's told me that this was one of the greatest events he had been in. He's been in many great events, I'm sure. This is one of the greatest events because of the way composers were given respect and listened to. Not simply their music, but their own reflections. I think those things are crucial for the development of a discourse around music. You have to get the people who are the producers of the music talking in an environment which is supportive and also challenging, and letting just ordinary people listen in and also be able to ask them questions, approach them directly, and find out what makes their music tick and what makes these people tick.
The event was very exciting. We didn't really know what to look forward to because we hadn't done it before. We knew that modern music does not always attract large audiences. We weren't sure if the particular kind of chemistry of theology and philosophy and music would work with a larger public. We weren't sure if the kinds of people that usually read books about theology would want to listen to modern music and vice, or the people interested in listening to modern music would want to have theologians talk to them about the meaning of it. But it worked fantastically well. There was a very large turnout. You could tell by the chemistry of the audience that people were responding very warmly and vigorously. The concert itself really exceeded expectations. It was especially Jonathan Berger's piece, Gia, was performed in a most sublime kind of way, which just left the audience breathless. So this was an exciting event.
I'm really glad that the Royal Conservatory and the Glenn Gould School could be part of this partnership to create this event. You know, we try and instill that it's never just about notes. It's always been about the ideas under the music. So here they could see the ideas under the music happening. And hopefully this will refer back to the earlier music and even the music being created now. So the students here are going to go out and be the future artistic leaders and musical leaders and artistic directors. And so I hope this will also inspire them to form wider events and partnerships around what they do. Because again, it's never just about the music, it's about the ideas around it.
Often when new music is performed and presented, it's performed and presented for a very small audience of people who are aficionados, they are in the know. This event was produced and performed for a general audience, and they showed up and they got something from it. I was leaving the concert and walking next to Jonathan Berger, our featured composer, and a longtime supporter of the institute where I teach came up to him and thanked him. This is a supporter who is not a musician, as far as I know, certainly not part of the new music scene, but he thanked him and said, "Your music was so moving, I cried." Jonathan and I did not know quite what to do with that remark, but obviously something got through, something connected, ways that a professional musician would perhaps not expect or maybe even be uncomfortable with. But it was very, very important. Obviously for this person, it was some chord that got struck that was going to resonate for a long, long time.
One of the important benefits that a number of people have commented on is how various people, you know, who are involved in the arts, who are thinking about the arts, from the musicians to the composers to, you know, a public who is receiving an art form, to the people who think about, you know, what art does and what it accomplishes, to the people who think about ethics, you know, those who are, you know, coming at that topic from a religious point of view or from a secular philosophical point of view. This was an occasion for all of these people to come together and to think, you know, about the way in which art can be a vehicle for the most significant issues that we treat as human beings.
Leuchtenden, so